We've all seen that one music review that looks like it's written for clout. You know, the one where the writer could pop off and talk some serious smack while showcasing their pedigree with a pen. And nowhere is that more notorious than on the website Pitchfork.com. The topic of today's video. Originally created by Ryan Schreiber in the summer of 1996 and inspired by fanzines and the alt-rock scene popular in the mid-90s, Pitchfork gave rise to incisive criticism that cut through the crap to become a notable tastemaker in league with Spin, Rollingstone, and Kerrang! Pitchfork was the website where hipsters could digitally genuflect in front of their collection of vinyl. Pitchfork was hip, it was cool, it was ahead of its time. In 2021, Pitchfork held its 25th anniversary. The article, The History of Pitchfork's Review section in 38 Reviews, mentioned something that was rather unique to their reviews. Their unique value proposition, if you will. And that is their point system. The unique way in which Pitchfork grades albums comes from it formerly judging albums through a percentage. The first album to receive a score by Schreiber was Pacer by the Amps, a Kim Deal side project, receiving an 82%, or as we would know it today, an 8.2, explains the article. The article is a fascinating read and also tells the story of one of the website's early 0.0 reviews, that of Sonic Youth's NYC Ghosts and Flowers. It wasn't the first album to receive a 0.0, but it was notable. The review was made by a writer who later apologized for the review, and to me this set the standard of idiosyncratic reviews. Reddit user Decabet writes, "I get that Pitchfork can be an easy target, and they have quite often earned that distinction. But one thing that I think is an undeniable sin on their part is the attention-seeking review. For example, very, very few of any albums in the history of recorded music truly merit a 0.0. That shit is immediately erodes journalistic integrity and makes the writer the center of the story in ways that are obnoxious and don't fit the gig. Start a blog if you just want to be a twat. But if you want to do it as part of an ostensibly journalistic enterprise, then it just makes everything that enterprise does suspect." And I think that perfectly encapsulates the problem people have with Pitchfork in particular. A lot of their more notable reviews don't seem to come from a genuine place, but rather as a way to be pretentious or snobby for not liking something that is popular, even if that thing warrants critical examination of some kind. This perspective would be known as rockism. Pitchfork, to me, really took off with the advent of social media. People on social media love to argue, and what better thing for music nerds to argue about but the merits of criticism surrounding their favorite album. Let me tell you about my experience as a writer. I myself have operated a hip-hop blog and podcast that I produced largely on my own, and for a period of time simultaneously worked as a freelance feature writer at Complex Magazine. Well, Complex Canada anyway, which for people who don't know me, might come as a shock, as I don't just have some hip-hop knowledge, but I'm also a trained journalist and worked as a news reporter as well, but that's beyond the scope of this video. The thing is, I think I offer a slightly different perspective on media culture than the average consumer, even professional YouTuber. I actually worked in media. And the media landscape is one of the most contentious but important issues of our time right now. Sure, I'm a little biased as a media worker, but I was also a consumer way before I became a journalist, and I think that is an important perspective. And the media landscape is changing, and not all of it for the better. Digital media for a long time was seen as the future. The rise of BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, Vice and Gawker, to name a few, used to mean something. Sure, arguably a lot of the material was clickbait, but clickbait was always the symptom, not the cause of a much larger problem. And that is of the media ecosystem. For a long time, advertising was the main source of revenue for media companies. This worked well in the age of print. However, something drastically changed in the digital age. Online advertising was much cheaper because online platforms were hell-bent on cutting out the middleman, even though they benefited and gained traction and therefore eyeballs and credibility through already established media outlets. This is how places like Facebook, Twitter became places for people to get their news for free, and these companies, at least at the time, never sought to capitalize and leverage this fact. They were just happy to get the stories out there to the public. The problem is, the genie was out of the bottle. So media companies ended up losing a lot of money, and this is a point that cannot be overstated. So in addition to incorporating a subscription-based model, the now gold standard in the news biz, sponsorships or advertorials became a long-standing practice. Enter the world today of native advertising or sponsored journalism or sponsored content or brand journalism, whatever name floats your boat. This became the death knell of music journalism in particular. Let's see if you get where I'm going. Online platforms like Spotify exercised more and more control. They could often dictate to publications what artists they wanted to push. Things like the Northern Bars playlist. The Northern Bars playlist is a playlist that purports to promote and celebrate the best that Canada has to offer. Well, I never saw what was happening behind the scenes. Oftentimes, I was tasked with creating lists of up-and-coming artists, sometimes, not always, local artists who I knew who had a buzz would get pushed out in favor of artists who had more connection to these playlists, such as the Northern Bars playlist, or connections to other mainstream artists in the industry. But wait, how does that connect to Pitchfork? Well, if you follow music sites, you might be familiar with the overwrought term pop optimism. I'll get to that later in this video. This is kind of conspiratorial, but I believe review sites would largely promote mainstream and pop acts as they had a financial incentive to do so to promote these artists that they knew would get clicks. Which leads me to the term playola, a play on the word payola, the illegal practice of paying radio stations under the table for radio play, updated for the digital age. In 2015, writer Glenn Peoples covered for Billboard the burgeoning importance of playlist promotion for artists. He writes, on August 5th, when Universal Music Group named industry veteran Jay Frank Senior VP Global Streaming Marketing and invested in his digital marketing firm, Digmark, for an undisclosed amount, an innovator in playlist promotion that charges label clients $2,000 for a 6-week campaign, Frank, who has a reputation among his peers as a data guru, as one of his business associates described Frank, seems a logical hire for a corporation such as UMG. Yet sources tell Billboard that Frank's company is among those that have adopted video promotion's unsavory practices. While Pitchfork was music criticism for the internet era, they stood on the shoulders of giant print magazines like Rolling Stone and Spin magazine. And this is a point that needs to be made because legacy media, or traditional media, has garnered a terrible reputation over the years in place of digital media. But these outlets mentioned here were the counterculture of the time. Rolling Stone was the place for media consumption in the 1970s. They were the counterculture. And without it, we would not have incredible writers like Lester Bangs, Ben Fong Torres, or even writer and musician Patti Smith. It was a cultural touchstone. Then enter Spin magazine. It was Gen X's answer to Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone had become the old guard, and Gen X was there to say, no, the kids have something to say. Like Rolling Stone, Spin helped launch careers, and was one of the first mainstream publications covering the burgeoning scene of hip-hop at the time with writer John Leland. Spin magazine was alternative music, not your dad's alternative music, actual alternative music, and was the go-to magazine of choice for fans of New Wave. But on the heels of Spin magazine and other print publications was Pitchfork, as I mentioned earlier, but other digital-only outlets like Noisy. So these old companies would now have to duke it out in the digital age. Essentially, brands had to come up with a different approach that was way more collaborative in digital outlets than they did on print. Take, for instance, the case of Noisy, Vice's former music vertical. The brand was created, believe it or not, to promote Dell computers. First described as an interactive magazine, the brand grew to be one of Vice's most successful verticals. The cost of making digital content was less than it was for print. So print magazines like Rolling Stone and Spin had to now compete with digital outlets in order to stay relevant. This is a problem because online content could often be produced quickly versus printing, which was scheduled at set times. Ask a journalist who's missed a print deadline before how fun that is. But still, at least you had time to write and report. And I'm talking from experience. But because of the quick turnaround in digital journalism, it can and has produced sloppier work and reporting. Take, for instance, when blogs circulated a quote from Post Malone out of context. What the articles following this headline didn't mention was Post Malone saying later in that same interview,
Trying to have a good time, stay in a positive mood. I listen to hip hop because it's fun. I think hip hop is important because it brings people together in a beautiful, happy way. Everybody's happy.
You had outlets having much less due diligence, which then leads into stuff like the now notorious misreported UVA campus Rolling Stone story that had failed to fact check and was overly reliant on one source. And on top of that, the creator of the magazine, Jan Warner, said some racist shit and tried to double down to defend his magazine's misreporting. So Rolling Stone definitely took a hit, and Spin magazine wasn't faring much better. In 2015, a Medium post titled "Someone Take the Wheel" by writer Chris Ott, who writes under the pen name Shallow Rewards, or the Shallow Reward series, came out about their 30th anniversary, and none of the writers or editors who built up the name decided to come out in support. He also writes in the column, Internet lists serve only as a ballast, helping increase the site's weight with search engine aggregators, busily prejudicing the world to the loudest consensus, which is never right nor consensus at all. Rather, a social contract that mandates you pay attention to the weekend if you want to work here, or be seen there, or hope to have access to anyone who might help you arrive at either destination. The success and failure of everyone who offers their work to this world, be they writer or musician, is predetermined by the interests of promoters and advertisers who fund digital music gateways, and without them, the music stops. This is pretty damning coming from Ott, who apparently was a notable figure in the indie music scene in the 90s. Welcome to the 2010s. Social media has taken off, and with it, introducing a new, more personable perspective to music criticism. In fact, no longer much of the conversation in music discourse is being brought forth by writers, but through what we now vaguely describe as content creators, or if we're being reductive, YouTubers. People like The Needle Drop, Den and Hip Hop, or Punk Rock MBA. These are the new cult of personality figures, much like a Lester Bangs or Robert Christgau. And I don't mean that in a derisive way. These are, for all intents and purposes, great creators who built up a following by putting themselves and their music takes out there. They took the template of the blog era, making music more accessible and personalized, and built on that personalization to be more authentic. The problem, I would argue, is that since these creators build up large followings and communities, often mirroring the creators themselves, there's a lack of diversity in opinion in the audience members. It's very much the idiom of preaching to the choir. In addition to this, while you can certainly research and take time to script video, arguably like this one, it doesn't require the same level of research from a well thought out article. It's made to be more digestible. Even in the case of someone like Professor Sky, who does great hip-hop analysis videos on YouTube, it still doesn't contextualize enough of an artist's background, the same way a feature article would. There are exceptions. I would highly recommend his video on Matt Comey's Pray for Haiti. However, not every video of his is going to be able to do that. There simply isn't a market for it, and this is a click-based economy. Even worse is the influencer interviewer archetype we have now. We have artists appearing on camera with influencers or streamers who don't commit to the same type of engagement a professionally trained journalist would. Love them or hate them, a Zane Lowe or Ebro has more dedication and craft in order to create engaging questions to challenge an artist rather than be a sycophant. To now where even the term critic has become somewhat of an existential question.
Yeah, don't let Spin fucking Magazine tell you what punk rock is because they have their fucking heads so far straight up their ass, they don't even know what to fucking do with themselves. Fuck this fucking punk rock handbook shit.
Critic has often been synonymous with hater. Remember Pitchfork? So much so that Pitchfork later tried to overcorrect and go in the direction of what we call pop optimism. Pitchfork was rightfully called out for being a boys' club for so long, and in 2019 appointed its first woman editor-in-chief, Pooja Patel. In a 2022 interview with Billboard senior editor Lindsay Havens, Patel said she actively went in with a mission with broadening the taste palette of the writers, and you can infer what you want. Havens asks, what were your goals as Pitchfork's editor-in-chief? Patel answers, I was mostly excited about taking an incredibly talented staff and helping build an even more expansively minded staff. She also explains that the taste of the site, Pitchfork, has gotten weirder and more engaged with popular music, and the readership has also become a lot more inclusive. Poptimism, for those unfamiliar with the term, is on the other end of the spectrum of rockism. While rockism was about the purity of rock and roll, poptimism brought forth the importance of mainstream artists like Taylor Swift and Beyonce, reifying them to the point where there are now university classes on these mainstream artists and their importance. Now, before I get attacked by the Swifties and the Bayhive, I would argue that yes, their output as mainstream acts being so commercially successful and for so long deserves some critical examination. However, I do not think it deserves the same amount of analysis as, say, a Kendrick Lamar album. While sure, arguably it is a good thing for a music outlet to broaden its horizons, places like Pitchfork, Rollingstone, or Spin were already established institutions with a perspective. it also isn't as impressive when presented with the reality that these outlets had to do so to compete with arguably more progressive and modern outlets like Noisy. And on top of that, even less impressive when you realize they are financially incentivized to do so when you have even a cursory knowledge of digital tools like Google Trends. It's like when big corporations want a pat on the back for ESG or corporate social responsibility measures. It's the musical equivalent of neoliberalism. Brands have exerted a soft control or hegemony over editorial for over a decade. Writers who built up legacy institutions have been pushed out in favor of digital media, which is simply not financially sustainable thanks to the greed of tech platforms. In order to compete in the digital market, critics have traded in their critical examination skills in favor of whatever will get them clicks, producing sloppily written and reported journalism, diluting the quality and therefore need for arts reporting from a consumer POV. So consumers have turned to content creators who have much more power to speak their mind and often reflect the same preconceived notions that their audiences have. Welcome to the Music Echo Chamber. Do you hate it here? I sure do.